My name is Ann Burkholder. I'm the Associate Dean of Methodist Studies at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and I'm an elder in the Florida Conference. The subject of my presentation is the impact and consequences of the process and results of the U.S. delegate counts that have just transpired for the 2020 General Conference. And the real bottom line question is, what does the data really tell us? Well, in responding to that question, in some ways I feel like I'm stating the obvious. But the bottom line answer really is, the data doesn't tell us as much as we would like. We would be remiss if we think that counting delegates and anticipating their views on legislation can help us predict the outcomes of the General Conference. Both sides are counting delegates and seeking data that will assure them that the Holy Spirit is at work and that God is on their side. So let's take a look at the first numbers of the data. Let's compare 2016, 2019, and 2020. In 2016, we had 864 delegates, of which 504 were US, 350 were from the central conferences, and 10 concorded. In 2019, most of those same delegates came again, 864 delegates, but the traditional plan passed by a vote of 438 to 384, which meant that 42 people were either not in their seats or not voting at all on the plans. In 2020, we have 862 delegates. You see the breakdown on this slide, 482 with a net reduction for the US with a net reduction of 22, 370 central conferences, and still 10 concorded. So digging a little deeper into the data, there's a difference of 102 votes between the US and the central conferences. So 482 US and 380 central conferences. But this also begs the question of who isn't in their seats and who isn't voting at the 2020 General Conference. And different conferences will address the role and the voting privileges of their reserve delegates differently. And so you will see some annual conferences handling who are reserves and who gets to be seated differently from each other. And if you go to the current umc.org and look at the reports of the annual conferences, one of the reasons why we cannot predict central conference inclinations is because they are so different, and that's where you can see just how different they are. For example, as I was reviewing the annual conference sessions from this year, Poland was celebrating the ordination of their first woman. Okay, their first woman, ordained an elder. By contrast, Western North Carolina in the southeastern jurisdiction was one of the last of the annual conferences to pass a resolution that completely rejected the traditional plan out of hand, and is petitioning the General Conference to remove those pieces of the discipline. And by contrast, yet again, in Liberia in January, when they had their annual conference, they were told to vote by the annual conference on the traditional plan in February of 19. So what really matters about the data? And quite frankly, it depends on the goals. So here we have the perception, at least, that 75% of the US delegates are centrist progressive. If we do the math right, that's about 359 votes, or 42% of the total General Conference delegates. 50% is 432. That's 50% plus 1, which means if we're going to do this math game, that in order to support more centrist progressive votes, we're going to need 73 more votes from the central conferences in order to pass a centrist progressive agenda. Germany would probably be included in that. My friend from the Philippines says you cannot predict. The Northern European and Eurasia conferences and the Central and Southern conferences tend to be divided along the old Iron Curtain lines. And the Concordat, we might be able to expect that the British Methodists would be supportive of a more centrist and progressive. So it really does have to do with the goals, though, as to how the numbers matter. Traditionalists are seeking to maintain control of the denomination and strengthen the accountability statements. Some are seeking a strengthening of the gracious exit, making it easier. But Rob Renfro's most recent posting is, we're not leaving, but we'll we'll negotiate for an amicable separation. So I refer you to the WCA site on that. Centrists and progressives now are speaking in terms of retaking control, eliminating the exclusionary language, resisting until the traditionalists leave, which Rob Renfro responds back to, we're not leaving, and provide a way to amicably separate. So you can see that if what you're coming into the process hoping to do is to remove the exclusionary language, you need that 432 votes, 50 plus 1. If you're working toward amicable separation, you're going to need a coalition of traditionalists and progressives, central progressives. So that's what I mean about it really depending on the goals. I want to highlight the shifts that have taken place since February 19th in the public and popular media releases from the groups. The traditionalists and WCAs moved from really seeking a gracious exit to winning, quote unquote. Then they went from winning to being shocked by the resistance and by seeking a way to cope or not with that resistance. And now they've moved, especially in the good news and WCA materials, from addressing the resistance to advocacy for amicable separation. The more centrist progressives, those of us who have been involved, for example, in the core meeting back in May or in the Minneapolis meeting also in May, have moved from the assumption that the one church plan would pass to despair and then a wake-up call. From the wake-up call to coalition building, organizing resistance, and talk of separation. And now more and more groups are moving from resistance and talk of separation to actual behind-the-scenes conversation about amicable separation. And you see this in the materials. Oh, Lordy, I better move fast. So, current impact, proliferation of new plans. We got plans and plans and more plans, all the way from continuing stay and resist. You see disaffiliation by individual churches, withdrawal en masse, amicable separation, and then versions of former connectional conference plans, including the Bard-Jones plan. The requirements for all of these are on this other half of the slide. Delegate alliances and growing networks. And I mean delicate. We've got to learn how to talk to each other. Historical and political wisdom of people who have been involved in this for a long time. Detailed understanding of the Book of Discipline. Clear explanations of consequences of different approaches for both the US and the global regions. Another current impact is the proliferation of logical fallacies. I'm not going to go through my list of 20 of them that I had identified in reading materials. But our hyper-focus on the data, while anecdotal, reflects a shift in our understanding of the role of delegates from delegates to representatives. The public voices of the various sides in the debate are focusing on signaling their constituencies regarding how their groups are operating behind the scenes and what they can expect in their submitted petitions. All sides need to study up on, recognize, and confess their use of logical fallacies in their arguments and start communicating with transparency, truthfulness, and grace. And then another current impact is the decline in apportionments. We've seen this. The new projected budget to be addressed in 2020 is going to be, I've heard two different numbers, 599 million or 493.8 million. Our current budget is 604 million. So there's already a significant current and potential impact. We see individual and collective resistance and leave-taking. And that's happening in all sorts of places. And then we have anticipated consequences. Time is short for petitions. I think we are anticipating chaos at the General Conference. Petitions are going to be all over the place. We have to pay attention to the collective support and the petitions that represent which groups and who submits them. And then we have got to do serious training with new and young adult in particular. I work with young adult delegates over what happens with the fight over the control of the rules. We saw that last time in 2016. Then how the legislative committees work and who gets assigned to which legislative committees and why, and how folks get elected as the chair and the vice chair and the secretary. And then the importance of keeping an eye on the consent calendar and how the plenaries work, and so forth. We've got a large group of brand new folks coming to this General Conference. Another, this one's continuing. The difference between being a representative and a delegate, asking questions. You'll see all of this on the slides once we finish. These are the questions being raised. How do we protect the good work that we're doing together? What is our ongoing responsibility? Another anticipated consequence has to do with how does the Judicial Council elections get managed. We have four Judicial Council members to be elected. How is that going to get managed? We've seen it go back and forth politically over the last 3 general conferences. What happens? Does the US become a central conference or a regional conference? Well, we can't become a central conference without a constitutional amendment because by definition, a central conference is outside the US. So the connectional table is referring to this and presenting a motion to get that process started. A secondary question is what happens to US jurisdictions. And what this will result in is a shift in our understanding of what it means to be a global church. Another anticipated consequence, which has been voiced publicly, is the impact on the election of US bishops in most of our jurisdictions, because far and away, because of that 75% plus or minus majority, we will have more progressive bishops elected. But some jurisdictions, I know this is being discussed in the southeastern jurisdictions, some are talking about electing fewer bishops than we would normally need or anticipate needing. So all of that is in flux. So what has to happen now? We have to gather information, question the data, examine sources, identify logical fallacies in the arguments, evaluate the risks. What are we willing to lose? What are we not willing to give up? In other words, what are we willing to die for? We have got to train the new and young delegates. We've got to strengthen our relationships and host honest conversation with delegates from other countries, identify common desires and goals and strategize around the best ways to reach everyone together and share our materials and ideas with each other. Thank you.